The tires of the armored sedan screamed against the wet pavement of the private drive, a sound like a dying animal echoing through the silent, cypress-lined estate. Inside, Dom Toretto, a man whose name was whispered in the backrooms of power with a mixture of reverence and terror, felt a cold sweat prickling his hairline. He didn't sweat. He didn't panic. But the voice of the maid, Elena, on the encrypted line 3 minutes ago hadn't just been shaking. It had been shattered. "Sir, come home right away. It's the girl. She's in the room. She's going to ruin everything. She'll ruin her, Dom. She'll ruin it all." The room was the inner sanctum. A place protected by biometric locks, thermal sensors, and a silent understanding that to cross the threshold without an invitation was to volunteer for a shallow grave in the valley. But his daughter, 7-year-old Clarice McLean, didn't understand the geography of ghosts or the borders of blood. To her, a locked door was simply a challenge from a father who was away too often. Dom threw the door open before the car had fully decelerated, his heavy boots thudding onto the gravel. The air in the foyer was thick with the scent of expensive floor wax and something sour: fear. Elena stood by the grand staircase, her hands buried in her apron, her knuckles white. She didn't look at him. She looked at the floor, her chest heaving in shallow, jagged breaths. "Where?" Dom's voice was a low growl, the sound of a predator finding a breach in its den. "The office," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the ticking of the grandfather clock. "I tried to stop her, but she had the key. The gold one. The one you keep in the safe behind the painting. Dom, I didn't know she knew the code. I swear on my mother's soul." Dom didn't wait for the apology. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had spent 20 years building an empire on the pillars of silence and absolute loyalty. His home was the one place where the war stayed outside. But as he reached the heavy mahogany doors of his study, he saw they were ajar. A sliver of light spilled onto the hallway carpet, and with it the sound of paper tearing. He pushed the door open, his hand instinctively reaching for the holster at the small of his back, then freezing. The office was a disaster zone. The floor was carpeted in white, thousands of pages of ledgers, offshore account records, and wiretap transcripts that represented the lifeblood of his organization. A Ming vase, a gift from a dead associate, lay in ceramic shards near the desk. But in the center of the chaos sat Clarice. She wasn't crying. She wasn't scared. She looked up at him with the wide, hauntingly intelligent eyes she had inherited from a mother who had died to keep her safe. In her small, ink-stained hands she held a thick manila envelope. It wasn't just any envelope. It was the one Dom had been searching for 3 months. The ghost file that contained the identity of the mole leaking his shipments to the authorities. "Daddy," Clarice said, her voice eerily calm. "He told me not to look. She said if I looked, the monsters would come." Dom felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Who, Clarice? Who told you that?" "The lady who gives me cookies," the girl whispered, holding the envelope out. "She put this in your chair. She said it was a surprise for you. But I wanted to see the surprise first." Dom stepped over the ruins of his secrets, his knees feeling weak. He took the envelope. It was addressed to him in a handwriting he recognized instantly. A graceful looping script he had seen on 1,000 grocery lists, birthday cards, and "I love you" notes. It was the handwriting of his wife's sister, the woman who had helped him raise Clarice. The woman who was currently downstairs, preparing dinner. Before he could open it, he heard the soft click of heels on the hardwood behind him. "Dom?" A soft, melodic voice asked from the doorway. "Is everything okay?" "I heard the car." Dom didn't turn around. He looked at his daughter, who was staring past him with a look of sudden, sharp recognition. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the wreckage of his sanctuary. The mystery wasn't how Clarice had gotten in. The mystery was why she had been invited to. Hello to all my wonderful viewers. It is so good to have you here for this journey. I see we have people joining us from all over the world. Thank you for spending your time with me. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love reading through them. And before we go any further into this web of secrets, how are you doing? I hope you're having a beautiful day. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have a massive story to tell today, and you won't want to miss a single twist. Dom finally turned. Standing in the doorway was Sarah Connor, her face a mask of concern that, for the first time in 5 years, looked like a cheap imitation of the truth. She was holding a tray of tea, the steam rising in delicate curls. She looked at the mess, then at the envelope in Dom's hand, and her eyes didn't flicker with surprise. They went cold. "Clarice, honey," Sarah said, her voice sweet but carrying an edge of steel. "Go to your room. Daddy and I need to talk about the mess you made." "No," Clarice said, standing up and gripping the hem of Dom's coat. "She's lying, Daddy. She didn't give me cookies. She gave me a secret, and told me if I didn't hide it, you would go away forever." The air left the room. Dom felt the walls closing in. He looked at the envelope again. This wasn't just a betrayal of business. It was a betrayal of the blood. He realized in that moment that the woman standing before him wasn't just his sister-in-law. She was the architect of his potential ruin, and she had used his only weakness, his daughter, as the delivery system for his destruction. "Sarah," Dom said, his voice a low, vibrating chord of fury. "Tell me why I shouldn't end this right now." Sarah didn't flinch. She set the tea tray down on a side table with a precise, chilling clink. "Because Dom," she said, her eyes boring into his, "if you open that envelope, you'll realize that I'm not the only one who has been keeping secrets. And if you kill me, you'll never find out who sent me to finish what your wife started." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. His wife. The woman he had mourned for 7 years? The woman he thought was a victim? Dom's thumb hooked under the seal of the envelope. He looked at Clarice, whose face was pale, her eyes darting between the two adults. He realized that tonight wouldn't just be about finding a mole. It would be about deciding if he could ever trust the walls of his own home again. He ripped the envelope open. Inside was a single photograph and a digital drive. The photograph was of a woman standing in a crowded marketplace in a city halfway across the world. She was older, her hair a different color, but the eyes were unmistakable. It was his wife. And she wasn't dead. "Daddy?" Clarice asked, her voice small and trembling. "Why is Mommy in the picture?" Dom looked from the photo to Sarah, whose smile was now something sharp and predatory. The silence in the room was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of his lungs. He had built an empire on the truth of his grief, and now that truth was a lie. The silence in the study was no longer the silence of a sanctuary. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. Dom Toretto stood frozen, the photograph trembling slightly between his calloused fingers. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but the woman's profile, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the specific curve of her jaw, was burned into his soul. His wife, Letty Ripley, was supposed to be ashes in a niche in the family mausoleum. He had carried her casket. He had felt the weight of her loss every morning for 7 years, a phantom limb that throbbed with every heartbeat. "Daddy, you're hurting the picture," Clarice whispered. Dom looked down. His grip had crinkled the edges of the photo. He forced his hand to relax, but his mind was a storm of fire. He looked at Sarah, who remained poised by the door, her expression shifting from cold calculation to a disturbing sort of pity. This was the woman who had moved into his guest house after the funeral, who had wiped Clarice's tears and been the sister Dom never had. Now she looked like a stranger wearing a familiar skin. "How?" Dom managed to choke out. The word felt like broken glass in his throat. "She didn't want this life for Clarice, Dom," Sarah said, stepping over a pile of scattered ledgers. She spoke with a terrifying calmness, as if they were discussing the weather rather than a resurrection. "She knew that as long as she was with you, the target on her back would eventually hit the girl. So she made a choice. A choice to die so that Clarice could live without the shadow of your world. And you helped her?" Dom's voice dropped to a register that made the glass in the windows hum. "You let me bury an empty box. You watched me break for 7 years. I did what was necessary for the child," Sarah countered, her eyes flashing. "But things changed. Letty isn't just hiding anymore, Dom. She's working. Hence you. That drive in your hand? It's the ledger of every shipment you've lost this year. She's the one providing the coordinates. She's the one bleeding you dry." The betrayal was a double-edged blade. One side was the lie of her death, the other was the truth of her war. Dom felt a surge of nausea. He looked at his daughter, who was watching them with a precocious, terrifying intensity. Clarice wasn't just a child in this moment. She was a witness to the deconstruction of her own history. Clarice, go to the kitchen. Tell Elena to make you some cocoa, Dom commanded, his eyes never leaving Sarah. But Daddy. Go. Now. The girl scurried out, her small footsteps echoing down the hallway. Dom waited until he heard the door at the end of the corridor click shut before he turned back to the woman he had trusted with his life. I want to take a quick second to check in with you all. This story is getting intense, isn't it? The layers of loyalty are starting to peel back and we're seeing the true faces of the people Dom kept closest. If you're enjoying the suspense so far, make sure to leave a comment letting me know who you think the real villain is. Is it the wife who died? Or the sister-in-law standing in front of him? Your engagement helps the channel so much. Dom moved with a sudden, predatory speed, closing the distance between him and Sarah until he was looming over her. He didn't draw his weapon. His presence was enough of a threat. You brought this into my house. You used my daughter to deliver a message. Why no? If you wanted me ruined, you could have done it years ago. Sarah didn't flinch. She leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper. Because the people Letty is working with, they aren't like you, Dom. They don't have a code. They don't care about family. They realized she was holding back to protect Clarice, so they've turned on her. They're coming for her, and when they find her, they'll find the link back to this house. I didn't give that envelope to Clarice to ruin you. I gave it to her because she's the only person you'd never ignore. I need you to find Letty before the others do. If she falls, we all fall. Dom stared at the digital drive. It was a small silver thumb drive, unassuming and cold. It represented the collapse of his reality. He thought of his best friend and second-in-command, Han Solo, a man who had been with him since the beginning. Han was the one who had handled the security for Letty's funeral. Han was the one who managed the very shipments that were being hijacked. If Letty was alive and Sarah knew, then who else was in on the ghost story? He walked back to his desk, sitting in the heavy leather chair that usually made him feel like a king. Today it felt like an electric chair. He plugged the drive into his encrypted laptop. The screen flickered to life, scrolling through lines of code before settling on a directory. There were folders named after his various fronts: shipping companies, real estate holdings, construction sites. He opened the one labeled Logistics. Inside was a series of intercepted emails. Subject: The Phoenix is ready. Body: The 0400 shipment out of the docks has no escort. Take it all. Leave no witnesses. The sender was an anonymous encrypted handle, but the recipient was an account linked to a private security firm owned by Danny Ocean, a man Dom had considered a neutral ally for a decade. You think this is Letty? Dom asked, pointing at the screen. I know it is, Sarah said. Look at the timestamps. They match the days she used to call me from the burner phones. She thought she was doing the right thing, Dom. She thought she was dismantling your empire so you'd be forced to retire, to take Clarice and disappear. She wanted to save you from yourself. Dom felt a bitter laugh bubble up in his chest. By stealing from me? By putting a target on our heads? She's a Ripley, Sarah said simply. She doesn't know how to ask for help. She only knows how to fight. Dom leaned back, his mind racing. He saw his world for what it was, a house of cards built on a foundation of secrets. He thought of the maid, Elena. She had called him in a panic, but was it because of Clarice or because she knew what was in that envelope? He realized he was surrounded by people who had been managing his life behind his back, treating him like a piece on a board they controlled. The emotional weight of the realization was staggering. He had spent years being the boss, the man who knew everything, the man who was always 3 steps ahead. In reality, he had been a blind man led through a minefield by people he loved. He looked at the photograph of Letty again. In the background of the marketplace, he noticed something he had missed before. A man was standing in the shadows of a doorway, watching her. He was tall, wearing a tactical jacket, his face partially obscured by a cap. But Dom recognized the stance. It was Brian O'Connor, his former protege who had retired to the coast 3 years ago. The betrayal wasn't a leak. It was a conspiracy. They're all alive, Dom whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. All the people I lost. They didn't die. They just left me. They didn't leave you, Dom, Sarah said softly, her hand finally reaching out to touch his shoulder. He flinched away. They were protecting the world from you. And now the world is coming for them. You have to decide if you're the man who destroys his enemies, or the man who saves his family, even the ones who lied to him. Dom stood up, his eyes hard as flint. The vulnerability he had felt moments ago was being paved over by a cold, calculating rage. He looked around his ruined office. The papers, the vase, the secrets. "I'm not saving anyone yet," Dom said. "First, I'm going to find out who else is breathing in my graveyard." He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It was time to call in a favor from the one person who hated his family as much as he loved them. "Elena," he bellowed. The maid appeared in the doorway seconds later, trembling. "Yes, sir. Pack a bag for Clarice. She's going to the safe house in the desert." "And Elena?" "Yes. If you ever lie to me again about what my daughter is doing, I won't call you. I'll come for you." As the maid scurried away, Dom turned to Sarah. "You're staying here. If I find out you've contacted anyone, I'll burn this house down with you inside it." He grabbed his keys in the drive. The night was just beginning, and the ghosts of his past were finally screaming for attention. The desert safe house was a concrete fortress masquerading as a ranch, tucked into the jagged shadows of the Mojave. Dom watched through the rearview mirror as the heavy iron gates swung shut, sealing Clarice behind 6 inches of reinforced steel and a dozen of his most loyal albeit confused soldiers. He had kissed her forehead, tasting the lingering scent of the cocoa Elena had made, and felt a crack in his chest that he hadn't felt since the day of the funeral. "Stay brave, little bird," he had whispered. "I'm not scared of the ghosts, Daddy," she had replied, her voice hauntingly steady. "I'm scared of the lady in the picture. She looks sad." Dom drove away without looking back. He couldn't afford to be a father right now. He had to be the boss. He had to be the monster that other monsters feared. The digital drive was plugged into the car's dash, and as he sped toward the neon glow of the city, he began to peel back the layers of the Phoenix operation. The inciting incident didn't happen with a bang, but with a silent notification on his screen. As he bypassed the third layer of encryption on the drive, a GPS tracker activated. It wasn't tracking him, it was tracking a secondary device. A beacon. And that beacon was currently moving at 60 miles per hour toward the very dock Sarah had warned him about. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. "You were never supposed to open that envelope, Dom," a voice crackled through the speakers. It was deep, gravelly, and carried the weight of 1,000 miles of regret. It was Max Rokotansky, a man who had once been Dom's primary rival before vanishing into the criminal underworld of the coast. "Sarah was supposed to keep you occupied. She was supposed to keep you in the house until the transfer was complete." "Max," Dom said, his grip tightening on the steering wheel until the leather groaned. "Where is she? Where is Letty?" "She's at Pier 42. But she isn't the one running the show, Dom. She's the cargo. Your friends didn't just hide her, they traded her. They used her as collateral for a debt you didn't even know you owed." "Who?" Dom roared. "The people who really run this city. The ones who make the Mafia look like a lemonade stand. They're called the Collective. And tonight they're hand-delivering your wife to a buyer from the East. If she gets on that boat, she's gone. Truly gone this time." Dom slammed his foot on the accelerator. The engine of the Charger roared, a mechanical scream that mirrored the fury in his gut. Pier 42 was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and corrupt customs officials. If Letty was there, she was surrounded by a literal army. He reached for his radio, the private channel he used only for emergencies. "Hon, do you copy? I need an intercept at the docks. Now." Silence. Only the hiss of static answered him. "Hon, answer me." "Hon isn't coming, Dom," Max's voice returned over the phone. "He's the one holding the clipboard at the pier. He's the one who signed the manifest. Why do you think your shipments were never recovered? He wasn't leaking them to Letty. He was using Letty's name to justify the losses to you. He made you believe your wife was a thief so you wouldn't realize your brother was the traitor." The betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing on Dom's lungs. Hon, the man who had sat at his table, who had held Clarice when she was a baby, who had been the best man at his wedding. It wasn't just Sarah. It wasn't just Letty. The entire foundation of his life was a meticulously crafted stage play, and he was the only one who hadn't read the script. As the docks came into view, Dom saw the silhouette of a massive freighter, the stark Indomitable, looming over the pier like a hungry beast. Searchlights cut through the mist, sweeping over the concrete. He didn't slow down. He rammed the gate, the metal snapping like toothpicks. He skidded to a halt amidst a maze of containers, drawing his custom .45 before his feet hit the pavement. Dom. Stop. He turned, gun leveled. Emerging from behind a stack of crates was a woman. She was wearing a dark tactical jumpsuit, her hair cropped short, her face scarred but undeniably beautiful. Ellen Ripley. His Letty. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding her side, blood seeping through her fingers. Don't come any closer, she gasped, her voice breaking. It's a trap, Dom. They need come. They used the girl to trigger the maid, they used the maid to trigger you. They needed you here to witness the transfer, so they could pin the whole syndicate collapse on your head. Witness what? Dom asked, his eyes searching hers, looking for the woman he loved beneath the layers of deception. You're alive, Letty. You lied to me for 7 years. You let me believe I was alone. I did it to keep the target off you, she cried, tears finally breaking through her hardened exterior. But Han, he found me. He told me he was protecting you too. He told me if I helped him reroute the money he could buy our way out. He lied to both of us, Dom. Suddenly the pier was flooded with light. High-intensity LEDs atop the containers clicked on, blinding them. How touching, a voice boomed over the PA system. Walking down the gangplank of the freighter was Han Solo. He wasn't wearing his usual casual jacket. He was in a sharp charcoal suit, looking every bit the cold-blooded executive. Beside him stood a man Dom recognized from the news. John McClane, a high-ranking official who was supposed to be the city's paragon of justice. You were always too sentimental, Dom, Han said, looking down at them with a detached sort of boredom. You thought this was about loyalty. It's never been about loyalty. It's about succession. You've been the king for too long. The board wants a CEO now. You used my daughter, Han, Dom said, his voice a low, terrifying hum. You put that envelope in her hands. I needed her to be the one to break your heart, Han shrugged. A broken man makes mistakes. And look at you, you're standing in the middle of a crime scene with a dead woman and a pile of stolen government bonds. The police are 3 minutes out. McClane here will get a promotion for taking down the Mafia boss and his terrorist wife. And I'll be the one who inherits the throne. This was the inciting incident that shattered the last of Dom's restraint. It wasn't just a discovery, it was an ambush of the soul. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for the very concept of truth. Letty, Dom whispered, not looking at her. Can you run? I can fight, she said, pulling a hidden blade from her sleeve, her eyes igniting with the old fire. Good, Dom said, his finger tightening on the trigger. Because tonight we're burning the board. At that moment the first siren wailed in the distance, and the first gunshot rang out from the ship's railing, sparking a war that had been brewing in the shadows of a happy home for nearly a decade. The first bullet struck the hood of the Charger with a metallic ping that echoed like a death knell across the docks. Dom didn't flinch. He grabbed Letty by the tactical vest and hauled her behind the thick steel of a shipping container just as a volley of automatic fire shredded the air where they had been standing seconds before. The smell of ozone and salt water filled his lungs, a familiar violent cocktail that cleared the fog of betrayal from his brain. You're hit, Dom growled, looking at the dark stain blooming across her side. I've had worse, Letty hissed, her teeth gritted against the pain. She leaned her head back against the rusted corrugated metal, her eyes searching his. For a heartbeat, the chaos of the pier faded. There was a raw, agonizing electricity between them, the ghost of a marriage and the reality of a war. Dom, I'm sorry. I should have told you. I should have trusted you were stronger than the target. We're past sorry, Letty. We're at survive, Dom replied, checking his magazine. Why is McClane here? A city official doesn't step into the mud unless he's already drowned in it. He's the buyer, she whispered. The bonds Han stole, they aren't just money. They're the digital keys to the city's infrastructure. Power, water, surveillance. Han isn't just taking your throne. He's selling the keys to the kingdom to the highest bidder. McClane is the middleman for a foreign syndicate. Above them, the searchlights from the Stark Indomitable swept the ground, the beams of light acting like fingers of a giant searching for a flea. Han's voice drifted down from the ship's railing, amplified and distorted. Dom, don't make this messy. You were always the one talking about family. Well, family is a business and you're a liability. Leave the girl's mother and walk away. Maybe I'll let you reach the desert before I send the cleaners for Clarice. Dom's vision went red at the mention of his daughter. The rising tension wasn't just the bullets, it was the ticking clock of a father's patience. "We need to move," Dom said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "If we stay here they'll pin us down. There's a crane about 50 yards east. If I can get to the controls I can drop a container on their primary exit route." "And me?" Letty asked, her hand moving to his arm. Her touch was cold but the connection was like a live wire. "You're going to do what you do best," Dom said, handing her a spare magazine. "You're going to provide the distraction. But Letty, if you disappear on me again after this I won't come looking. I'll just keep the memory of the woman I loved and bury the one standing here." The pain in her eyes was more visible than the wound in her side. "I'm not going anywhere, Dom. Not this time." They moved like a choreographed unit, a lethal dance they had perfected over a decade of marriage. Letty broke cover first, firing controlled bursts toward the gangplank to keep Han's shooters behind the railing. Dom stayed low, moving through the shadows of the containers with the silence of a mountain lion. As he ran he pulled a small device from his pocket, a localized jammer. He flipped the switch and the pier was suddenly plunged into a different kind of chaos. The LED floodlights flickered and died. The PA system let out a screeching howl before going silent. In the sudden darkness, the tension reached a boiling point. Shouts erupted from the ship. "Find them. They're in the dark." McLean screamed. Dom reached the ladder of the massive gantry crane. He climbed, his muscles screaming, his heart hammering against his ribs. From this vantage point the pier looked like a chessboard. He could see Han and McLean retreating toward the bridge of the ship. He could see Letty, a shadow moving between crates, drawing fire away from the ladder. But he also saw something they didn't. 2 black SUVs were screaming toward the pier from the opposite direction of the police sirens. These weren't cops. These were the cleaners Max had warned him about. The collective was arriving to ensure there were no witnesses left, not even Han. "Letty," sighed. "Get to the water," Dom shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. He reached the crane cabin, smashed the window and hot-wired the controls. With a groan of tortured metal, the massive arm of the crane began to swing. He aimed it not at the ship but at the path of the incoming SUVs. Crash. A 40-foot steel container slammed onto the concrete, creating a barricade that sent the first SUV flipping into the bay. The explosion lit up the night, a fireball that turned the mist into a glowing orange shroud. Dom scrambled down the ladder, jumping the last 10 feet and landing hard. He sprinted toward Letty's last known position. He found her pinned behind a stack of lumber, 2 of Han's men closing in on her. Dom didn't hesitate. He fired as he ran, taking the first shooter in the shoulder and the second in the chest. He slid into the dirt beside Letty, pulling her into a protective embrace as more bullets shredded the wood above them. "The collective is here," he breathed into her ear. "They're going to sink the ship with everyone on it to hide the evidence." Letty looked at him, her face streaked with dirt and blood, but her eyes were clearer than he had seen them in years. "Then we have to get on that ship, Dom. The evidence is on the bridge. The drive I gave you, it only has half the data. Han has the physical keys. If we don't get them, McLean wins even if he dies." The obstacles were mounting. A bleeding wife, a traitorous best friend, an approaching shadow army, and a city official who held the law in his pocket. The tension was no longer a string. It was a cable about to snap. "Why did you wait so long to come back?" Dom asked, his voice suddenly small amidst the roar of the fire. Letty reached up, her bloody thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "Because I thought I'd ruined you. I thought if I stayed away you'd become a better man for Clarice. I didn't realize that without me, you'd just become a target for the people who knew my secret." "I was never a better man without you," Dom said, leaning his forehead against hers. "I was just a man waiting for the other shoe to drop." The sound of a helicopter approaching cut through their moment. The collective's heavy hitters were arriving. "Let's go get our life back," Dom said, standing up and pulling her to her feet. They turned toward the Stark Indomitable. The ship was their only way out, and the only place where the truth could finally be hammered out in lead and blood. But as they reached the base of the gangplank, a figure stepped out from the smoke. It was Elena, the maid. She wasn't holding a tray of tea. She was holding a submachine gun and she was pointing it directly at Dom's heart. "I'm sorry, Dom," she said, her voice devoid of its usual tremor. But they have my family too. The sight of Elena, the woman who had tucked Clarice into bed for 3 years, the woman who knew how his daughter liked her crusts cut off her sandwiches, holding a suppressed MP5 at his chest was the final crack in Dom's reality. The world didn't just feel dangerous anymore. It felt hallucinated. "Lower the weapon, Elena," Dom said, his voice dropping to a terrifying subsonic frequency. "You don't want to do this. You love that little girl." "I do love her, Dom. That's why I'm doing this." Elena screamed, her composure finally breaking, tears streaming down her face even as her aim remained steady. "The collective. They didn't just find me. They created me. They planted me in your house before Letty even died. They've been waiting for the moment the phoenix rose so they could harvest the ashes. They told me if I didn't stop you from getting on that ship, they'd send Clarice to the same place they sent her mother." Letty stepped forward, ignoring the fire in her side. "Elena, look at me. I'm standing right here. They lied to you. They didn't send me anywhere. I ran. And if you pull that trigger, you aren't saving Clarice. You're becoming the very thing she needs protection from." The standoff was a heartbeat away from a massacre. But then a sudden violent shudder rocked the pier. A massive explosion detonated at the stern of the Stark Indomitable. The shockwave threw them all off balance. Elena stumbled, and in that split second of vulnerability, Dom didn't fire. He lunged, disarming her with a swift, brutal twist of her wrist and pinning her against a shipping container. "Who is running the collective, Elena? Give me a name, or I swear to God, the desert safe house will be the last thing you ever see," Dom growled. Elena gasped for air, her eyes wide with terror. "It's not a who, Dom. It's a was. You think you're fighting your enemies? You're fighting a ghost." She choked out a sob. "Look at the drive again. Look at the hidden partition labeled Project Genesis. It wasn't Han's idea. It wasn't McLean's. It was Vito Corleone, your father's old partner. The man you thought was executed in the 90s. Dom felt the blood drain from his face. Vito Corleone. The man who had taught him how to hold a gun, how to respect the code, and how to value family above all else. If Vito was alive, then the last 20 years of Dom's life had been a carefully curated lie designed to build an empire that Vito could eventually reclaim. "He's on the ship, isn't he?" Dom asked, his voice hollow. Elena nodded weakly. "In the hold. He's the one McLean is delivering the keys to. He doesn't want to destroy the city, Dom. He wants to own it. And he needs you and Letty out of the way so he can be the grandfather Clarice never had. He wants to start over with her. A clean slate. A new legacy." Dom released Elena, his hands shaking with a mixture of grief and pure, unadulterated loathing. He turned to Letty. She looked just as shattered. They had been fighting for their lives, but they were actually fighting for the soul of their daughter against a man who was a legend in their world. "We have to get on that ship," Letty whispered. "Now. Before it leaves the pier." They didn't look back at Elena. They sprinted toward the gangplank as the Stark Indomitable began to groan, its massive engines churning the black water of the harbor into a frothy, oily mess. Bullets from the cleaners in the SUVs whizzed past them, sparking off the metal railings. They reached the deck just as the lines were cast off. The ship began to drift away from the pier, a floating fortress of secrets. Inside the ship, the air was cold and smelled of diesel and old blood. They moved through the narrow corridors, their footsteps muffled by the hum of the machinery. They reached the entrance to the main hold, a massive cavernous space filled with luxury cars and sealed crates. And there, sitting in a plush leather armchair that looked absurdly out of place amidst the industrial setting, was an old man. He was draped in a heavy wool coat, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. Beside him stood Han Solo and John McClane, looking like loyal soldiers in the presence of a king. "Welcome home, Dominic," the old man said, his voice a rasping caress. It was him. Vito Corleone. He looked like a corpse brought back to life, pale, wrinkled, but with eyes that held the sharp, predatory intelligence of a hawk. "You died in 98, Dom said, his gun leveled at the old man's heart. "I saw the body. I saw the fire. You saw what I wanted you to see," Vito smiled, showing teeth that were too white to be real. "I needed a successor who was hungry. A man who would build something worth taking. You did a marvelous job, Dom. Truly. But you became soft. You started caring about happiness and innocence. This world doesn't allow for those things. This world requires a shark, not a father. Is that why you staged Letty's death? Dom asked, his finger tightening on the trigger. Letty was an anomaly, Vito said, glancing at her with mild distaste. She was the only thing you loved more than the power. I thought removing her would make you colder. Instead it made you a martyr. So, I had to bring her back into the fold to lure you here. You see, Dom, you can't be killed in the street. You're a hero to the men. But if you die on this ship alongside your traitorous wife while attempting to steal from the city, then your legacy is ruined, and I can step in as the grieving mentor to raise your daughter in my image. The revelation was a game-changer. The entire night, the maid's call, the envelope, the daughter's discovery, had been a play directed by Vito. Even Han's betrayal was just a scripted move in a larger game. You're not taking her, Letty hissed, her gun raised. Oh my dear, Vito said, taking a slow sip of his drink. I already have her. Han, show them the monitor. Han, with a look of genuine regret that didn't stop him from following orders, clicked a remote. A screen on the wall flickered to life. It was a live feed from the desert safe house. The loyal soldiers Dom had left there were all lying face down in the dirt. And standing in the center of the courtyard, holding Clarice's hand, was a man in a black suit. The safe house was a trap, Dom, Han whispered. I'm sorry. I really am. But the old man, he always has a backup plan. Dom felt a scream building in his throat, a sound of total, devastating betrayal. His sanctuary was gone. His daughter was a hostage. And the man who had raised him was the one holding the knife. Now, Vito said, standing up with a groan of old bones. Drop your weapons or I give the order to end the Toretto line right now. It's time to discuss the terms of your surrender. The stakes had never been higher. The revelation of the true mastermind had turned their mission from a fight for truth into a desperate gamble for a child's life. The hum of the ship's engines felt like a vibration in Dom's very marrow. A funeral dirge played in the key of heavy machinery. He stood in the center of the hold, the cold steel of the floor chilling his feet through his boots. His gun, the weapon that had been an extension of his arm for 2 decades, felt impossibly heavy. He looked at the screen, at the tiny, defiant figure of Clarice standing amidst the bodies of his men, and felt the foundations of his world turn to ash. Drop it, Dom, Han said, his voice cracking. Please. He'll do it. You know he'll do it. Dom's hand opened. The .45 hit the deck with a hollow, final clack. Beside him, Letty did the same, her silver pistol sliding across the floor toward McLean's feet. She looked at Dom, and for the first time since he had known her, since they were teenagers racing stolen cars through the industrial districts, he saw true, unadulterated hopelessness in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of death. It was the agony of a mother realizing she had walked into a trap that used her own daughter as the bait. Good, Vito purred, settling back into his chair. A king should know when his checkmate has arrived. John, take them to the lower brig. Secure them separately. I want Dominic to have a few hours of silence to contemplate the end of his era. McLean stepped forward, his face twisted in a smirk of bureaucratic triumph. He shoved Dom toward the door, the barrel of a rifle pressed hard into the base of Dom's skull. As they were led away, Dom looked back at Han. His oldest friend wouldn't meet his gaze. He was staring at the floor, a man who had sold his soul for a seat at a table that was already rotting. The lower brig was a hellscape of dripping pipes and shadows. They threw Letty into a cell at the far end of the corridor, the heavy iron door slamming shut with a sound that felt like a guillotine. Dom was pushed into a small windowless room 2 doors down. The click of the lock was the loudest sound he had ever heard. Dom slumped against the damp wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. The darkness was absolute. In the silence, his mind raced through every decision he had made. Every person he had killed, every shipment he had guarded, every lie he had told himself about safety. It had all led here. He had built a fortress out of sand and the tide had finally come in. Letty, he whispered, his voice catching. I'm here, Dom. Her voice drifted through the vents, thin and strained. She was losing blood. He could hear the ragged edge of her breathing. I'm so sorry. I thought I was being the hero. I thought I was the one keeping her safe by staying dead. We both failed her, Dom said, his head in his hands. We played right into his hands. He wanted us together. He wanted us on this ship. He wanted the legacy clean, so he could start over with Clarice. He won't keep her, Dom, Letty rasped. Vito doesn't love anything. He'll turn her into a weapon. He'll erase us from her memory and fill the holes with ice. The thought of Clarice, with her bright, inquisitive eyes and her mother's stubborn streak, being turned into a cold-blooded operative for a dead man's syndicate was more than Dom could bear. It was a physical pain, a crushing weight on his chest that made every breath a struggle. He was the great Dominic Toretto, the man who feared nothing, and yet in this dark hole he was just a father who had let his child down. Suddenly, a faint scratching sound echoed from the corner of the room. Dom froze, his instincts sharpening through the fog of despair. "Dom?" a tiny electronic voice whispered. He scrambled toward the sound. Hidden behind a rusted pipe was a small black puck, a high-end comms relay. "Max." Dom breathed. "I'm in the ventilation," Max Rokotansky's voice crackled. "The collective isn't a monolith, Dom. There are those of us who remember your father. Those of us who don't want to see a Corleone back on the throne. But I can't get to the brig. Han's men are everywhere." "Max, they have Clarice at the safe house," Dom hissed. "I know. But they don't have the codes. Vito thinks he has the keys, but he's missing the sequence. The girl, she's smarter than you think, Dom. She told them she wouldn't talk until she heard your voice. She's stalling them. Hope is a dangerous thing in the dark. It flickers and burns, and if it goes out, the darkness is twice as heavy. But for Dom it was the only thing left. How do I get out of here?" "I can't open the door from the outside without triggering the alarm," Max said. "But the pipes in that room, they're old. Steam-fed. If you can cause a pressure surge, the gaskets will blow. It'll be hot, Dom. It'll burn. But it'll buck the hinges." Dom looked at the heavy iron pipes running along the ceiling. He was a mechanic before he was a boss. He knew the physics of pressure. He knew that to save his daughter he would have to walk through fire. "Do it," Dom said. "Tell Letty to cover her face." "Dom, wait," Max's voice was solemn. "If you do this, there's no going back. You won't just be fighting Han or McLean. You'll be declaring war on the very idea of the Mafia. You'll be an outlaw to the outlaws." "I was never one of them anyway," Dom said, standing up and wrapping his jacket around his forearms. "I'm just a father coming for his kid." The sound of the engines changed. A deep, thrumming roar began to build beneath his feet as Max bypassed the engine room's safety valves. The pipes in the room began to groan, the metal expanding with a high-pitched screeching protest. Dom stood in the center of the room staring at the door. He thought of the photograph in the manila envelope. He thought of the maid's betrayal. He thought of his father's partner, the man who had stolen his life twice. "Bring the heat," Dom whispered. With a deafening crack, the main steam gasket shattered. A wall of white-hot vapor exploded into the room, searing the air and turning the brig into a furnace. Dom screamed as the heat lashed his skin, but he didn't move. He watched as the pressure built against the door, the iron groaning under the impossible force of the trapped steam. The door didn't just open. It was launched. The hinges snapped like toothpicks, and the heavy metal plate was blown into the corridor, followed by a cloud of scalding white fog. Dom stumbled out, his skin red and blistering, his lungs burning, but his eyes were filled with a terrifying cold light. He reached Letty's cell and kicked the lock mechanism that had been weakened by the blast. He pulled her out of the shadows. She was weak, but she was alive. "We're going to the bridge," Dom said, his voice a scorched rasp. "We have no guns, Dom," she whispered, leaning on him. Dom looked down at his hands, scarred, burned, and shaking with a father's rage. "I don't need a gun for what I'm going to do to Vito." They were at the lowest point. Beaten, burned, and outnumbered on a ship in the middle of the ocean. But the darkest hour had passed. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the fire had started. The air in the corridor was a thick, suffocating veil of white steam and the acrid scent of scorched insulation. Dom moved through the fog like a vengeful spirit, his arm draped around Letty, supporting her weight even as his own nerves screamed from the blistering heat of the pressure blast. They were ghosts in the machine of the stark Indomitable, moving through the bowels of the ship where the crew rarely ventured. "Dom, stop," Letty gasped, her voice cracking as she leaned against a vibrating bulkhead. Her face was pale, the blood loss finally catching up to her, but her eyes remained fixed on the mission. "We can't just walk onto the bridge. There are 20 men between here and Vito, and we're empty-handed." Dom looked at his hands. The skin was raw, the adrenaline the only thing keeping the shock at bay. He looked around the narrow maintenance tunnel they had ducked into. It was a graveyard of industrial tools. Heavy wrenches, coils of steel cable and high-pressure canisters of industrial lubricant. "We aren't walking onto the bridge," Dom said, his voice a low, gravelly promise of violence. "We're going to dismantle the ship from the inside. Vito wants a kingdom. I'm going to give him a wreck." He reached out and grabbed a heavy steel pipe wrench, its weight familiar and grounding. He didn't just see a tool, he saw a lever to move the world. He began to strip the insulation from a bundle of thick copper wiring running along the ceiling. "Max," Dom whispered into the comms relay he had salvaged. "I need you to listen. If you can't get to the safe house, I need you to trigger the failsafe on the ship's ballast system. If we can tilt this boat 10 degrees to the port side, the cars in the hold will shift. It'll create enough noise to draw the guards away from the elevators." "Dom, if the cargo shifts, the ship could capsize in this weather." Max's voice crackled back, filled with hesitation. "Let it sink," Dom growled. "Vito's legacy ends at the bottom of the Atlantic. Just give me the window." As the ship began to groan, a deep, metallic moan of shifting weight, Dom and Letty reached the secondary armory. It was a small locker used by the night watch, and as the ship tilted, the electronic lock malfunctioned just long enough for Dom to shoulder the door open. Inside weren't just guns. There were tactical vests, flashbangs, and a pair of serrated combat knives. Letty grabbed a lightweight submachine gun, her movements fluid and practiced despite her injury. She checked the chamber, the metallic click of the bolt sounding like a heartbeat returning to a dead body. "I'm ready," she said, looking at Dom. But Dom didn't reach for a rifle. He picked up a flare gun and a pouch of magnesium charges. He looked at Letty, and for the first time in 7 years, the wall between them wasn't made of lies or grief. It was made of shared purpose. "We do this for her," Dom said. "Everything else is just noise." They moved upward, using the service ladders to bypass the main elevators. They reached the level just below the bridge where the luxury cars were secured. As the ship continued to tilt, a silver Ferrari broke its tethers, sliding across the deck with a thunderous crash that shook the entire vessel. The chaos worked. Shouts erupted from above. Footsteps pounded on the metal stairs as Han's security team rushed down to secure the cargo. Dom and Letty pressed themselves into the shadows of a heavy support pillar, watching as the guards scrambled past. "Now," Letty whispered. They slipped onto the bridge just as the heavy doors were closing. The room was a command center of glass and flickering monitors, overlooking the dark, churning sea. Vito sat in the captain's chair, his face illuminated by the green glow of the radar. McLean stood by the helm, his hand on his sidearm, looking nervous as the ship listed. "What is happening to the ballast?" Vito demanded, his voice thin and sharp. "McLean, get the captain on the line." "The captain isn't answering, Vito." Dom's voice rang out from the back of the bridge. Vito turned, his eyes widening as he saw Dom and Letty standing there, burned, bloody but standing tall. The flare gun in Dom's hand was pointed directly at the bridge's oxygen-rich ventilation intake. "Dominic," Vito said, his voice regaining its oily composure. "I should have known a little steam wouldn't stop you. You always were a stubborn boy. I stopped being a boy the day you told me my father was a hero while you were the one who put him in the ground," Dom said. The bridge went silent. Even McLean froze. The revelation of Vito's ultimate betrayal, the murder of Dom's father, was the final piece of the puzzle. Dom had spent his life trying to live up to a code that had been written in his father's blood by the man standing in front of him. "Your father was a dreamer, Dom," Vito sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "He thought the Mafia could be a social club. I knew it had to be an industry. I did him a favor. I gave him a legendary death so you could have a legendary life. And now I'm giving you the end you deserve," Dom said. Suddenly, the monitor on the wall, the one showing the live feed of Clarice, flickered. The man in the black suit at the safe house suddenly dropped his weapon and clutched his throat. Behind him, a shadow moved. It was Elena. She had made it to the safe house. She hadn't gone to save her own family. She had gone to save the girl who called her Auntie. On the screen, Elena grabbed Clarice and ducked behind a stone wall just as a secondary team of collective soldiers arrived. "The girl is gone, Vito," Dom said, a grim smile touching his lips. "You have no leverage. You have no kingdom. You just have a sinking ship and a man who has nothing left to lose." Vito's face twisted into a mask of pure ancient rage. He looked at McLean. Kill them. Kill them both. McLean drew his weapon, but Letty was faster. A single, precise shot took the corrupt official in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun skittering across the floor. But the victory was short-lived. The bridge doors hissed open and Han Solo stepped inside. He wasn't looking at Vito. He was looking at Dom. In his hand he held a remote detonator. I can't let you do it, Dom, Han said, his voice trembling. If you kill him, the syndicate goes into a vacuum. The whole city will burn. Thousands of people will die in the crossfire. You have to let him go. Dom looked at his best friend, the man who had shared his bread and his secrets. The turning point was here. It wasn't just about killing a villain. It was about deciding what kind of man would be left standing when the smoke cleared. Han, Dom said softly. Look at me. Look at what he's turned you into. You're talking about order while you're holding a bomb. That's not who we are. We are whoever we have to be to survive. Han screamed. No, Dom said, taking a step forward, ignoring the red dot of a laser sight that appeared on his chest from a sniper on the outer deck. We are who we choose to be when the world gives us every reason to be monsters. At that moment the Stark Indomitable hit a massive swell. The ship lurched and the glass of the bridge shattered under the pressure of the wind and spray. In the chaos of glass and salt water, the power cut out, plunging them into a strobe light reality of emergency red flasher. The turning point was complete. The roles had shifted, the hostage was free, and the truth was out. Now there was only the climax. A battle for the very heart of the Toretto legacy. The red emergency lights strobed against the shattering glass of the bridge, turning the spray of the Atlantic into droplets of falling rubies. The Stark Indomitable was dying, leaning heavily into the dark embrace of the ocean, but inside the command center, time had crystallized into a single jagged moment of reckoning. Dom stood centered in the chaos, the flare gun in one hand and the heavy pipe wrench in the other, a king of the ruins. Across from him, Vito Corleone sat gripped in his chair, his wrinkled hands clutching the armrests as if he could hold on to his vanishing empire by sheer force of will. Between them stood Han, the detonator in his hand, a plastic heart that beat with the rhythm of impending destruction. It's over, Han, Dom shouted over the roar of the wind whistling through the broken panes. The girl is safe. The keys are useless if there's no city left to unlock. Drop the remote and walk toward me. Han's eyes were wild, darting between the man who had been his brother and the man who had promised him the world. I can't, Dom. If I drop this, the fail-safes in the hold go off. The whole ship becomes a tomb. I was trying to keep the peace. I was trying to make sure we didn't go back to the 90s, back to the street wars. You were trying to play God, Han. Letty cried out from the flank, her submachine gun leveled at the door where more of the collective's guards were beginning to gather. But you're just a man. And men like Vito, they don't want peace. They want property. Vito let out a dry, rattling laugh. Property? Oh my dear. I wanted a legacy. I wanted something that would outlive the flesh. Dominic was supposed to be that legacy. But he chose a maid, a ghost, and a child over the throne. He looked at Han, his voice turning into a venomous hiss. Press it, Han. End the disappointment. Let the sea have the Toretto name. Don't do it, Han, Dom said, his voice dropping to a calm that was more terrifying than the storm. He stepped forward, the red light catching the deep burns on his arms. Look at me. Look at the man you spent 10 years with. If you press that button, you aren't saving the city. You're just proving Vito right. That loyalty is a lie we tell ourselves until the price gets too high. Han looked at the detonator. His thumb hovered over the red toggle. His hand was shaking so violently the plastic casing rattled. He looked at Dom, and for a fleeting second the cold, corporate shell of the new Han cracked. He saw the grease-stained hands of the friend he used to race with. He saw the man who had pulled him out of a burning wreck in Tokyo. I'm sorry, Dom, Han whispered. But he didn't press the button. He turned and hurled the detonator through the shattered window of the bridge. It tumbled into the black, churning waves below, lost forever to the depths. Traitor! Vito roared, struggling to stand. Before the old man could reach for the backup transmitter in his coat, the bridge doors were kicked open. The remaining collective cleaners burst in, led by a man Dom hadn't seen since the beginning of the night. The lead mercenary from the safe house, a man named Rick Deckard. The girl got away, Deckard barked, his rifle scanning the room. The maid took her through the scrub. The contract is blown, Vito. We're leaving. You leave when I say you leave. Vito screamed, his voice breaking into a high-pitched frantic trill. The ship is sinking, old man, Deckard said, his eyes landing on Dom. He saw the flare gun. He saw the look in Dom's eyes. The look of a man who had already walked through one fire and was looking for a second. You want him, Toretto? He's all yours. We don't work for corpses. The mercenaries backed out, disappearing into the dark corridors to find the lifeboats. They were professionals. They knew when the math of survival no longer added up. Now the bridge was empty of everyone but the family. Dom, Letty, Han and the ghost. McLean, still clutching his wounded shoulder, tried to crawl toward the exit, but Letty stepped on his hand, her boot grinding into the floor. You aren't going anywhere, John. You're going to stay here and watch the world you sold sink. Dom turned his full attention to Vito. He dropped the wrench. He didn't want a tool. He wanted the truth. You killed my father, Dom said, moving slowly toward the chair. You sat at our table. You drank his wine. You hugged me at the funeral. And all the while, you were the one who cut the brake lines. Vito didn't look afraid anymore. He looked tired. The weight of his 90 years seemed to settle on him all at once. He was weak, Dominic. He wanted to go legitimate. He wanted to turn the syndicate into a union. He would have gotten us all killed by the feds. I saved the family by sacrificing the head. You didn't save the family, Dom said, reaching out and grabbing Vito by the lapels of his expensive wool coat. He hauled the old man out of the chair, forcing him to look at the wreckage of the bridge. You turned us into ghosts. You turned Letty into a runaway. You turned Han into a coward. You took the blood out of the name and replaced it with ink and ledgers. I made you a king. Vito spat, a line of red foam appearing at the corner of his mouth. I was never a king, Dom growled. I was a Toretto. And that means something you'll never understand. A massive groan rippled through the hull. The Stark Indomitable took its final plunge, the bow dipping beneath the waves. Water began to pour onto the bridge through the broken windows, a cold, salt-heavy deluge. Dom, we have to go. Letty shouted, grabbing his arm. The lifeboats are being launched. If we stay, the suction will take us down. Dom looked at Vito. The old man was staring at the water with a strange, glassy fascination. He knew he couldn't survive the swim. He knew his era was over. Leave him, Dom said. Dom? Han asked, stepping forward. He wants to be a legend? Dom said, his voice cold as the Atlantic. Let him be a legend of the deep. Let him stay with his ship. I'm going to see my daughter. Dom turned his back on the man who had shaped his life, a final act of defiance that hurt more than any bullet. He took Letty's hand and they began to run. Han followed, his head bowed, the weight of his shame a visible burden on his shoulders. They sprinted through the tilting hallways, the water rising to their knees. They reached the deck just as the final lifeboat, manned by a few panicked crew members, was being lowered. Stop! Dom roared. The crew looked up, seeing the blood-soaked, burned giant of a man and the woman with the submachine gun. They halted the winch. Dom helped Letty into the boat, then turned to Han. Han stood on the edge of the sinking deck, looking at the water. Go on, Han, Dom said. Get in. I don't deserve a seat, Dom, Han said softly. I almost killed you. I almost killed Clarice. Dom grabbed Han by the back of the neck, pulling him close until their foreheads touched. You're an idiot, Han. You're a traitor and a fool. But you're my fool. Get in the boat. We'll settle the bill on dry land. With a sob, Han climbed in. Dom followed, the lifeboat hitting the water with a splash just as the Stark Indomitable's stern rose into the air like the tail of a dying whale. They rowed frantically, pulling away from the massive vessel. As they reached a safe distance, the ship let out one final haunting roar of escaping air. The lights flickered once, twice, and then vanished. The ocean swallowed the ghost file, the syndicate ledger, and Vito Corleone. The Phoenix had finally been extinguished. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the slap of waves against the lifeboat and the heavy breathing of the survivors. Dom sat in the center of the boat, holding Letty against his chest. She was shivering, her wound finally beginning to clot in the cold air. We did it, she whispered. Not yet, Dom said, looking toward the dark horizon where the California coast lay hidden in the mist. We aren't done until I hold her. The hours that followed were a blur of cold and salt. They were eventually picked up by a Coast Guard cutter. Not the corrupt officials McLean had promised, but a real search and rescue team alerted by Max Rokotansky. As they were pulled onto the deck of the cutter, Dom refused the blanket and the medical attention. He stood at the railing, his eyes fixed on the shore. The morning sun began to break through the clouds, a pale gold light that turned the gray sea into a sheet of hammered brass. As the cutter pulled into the harbor, Dom saw a familiar black SUV parked on the pier. Standing beside it was a woman in a torn apron, holding the hand of a small girl in a pink jacket. "Clarice!" Letty screamed, her voice breaking. The girl on the pier looked up. She saw the ship. She saw the tall man and the woman leaning on him. She broke away from Elena and began to run, her small feet flying over the concrete. Dom didn't wait for the gangplank. As the cutter touched the dock, he jumped. He landed hard, his knees buckling, but he didn't care. He was running before he was even fully upright. "Daddy! Mommy!" The impact of the child hitting his chest was the only thing that made the night real. Dom fell to his knees, wrapping his scorched arms around his daughter, pulling her into the space between him and Letty, who had followed him off the boat with a limp. They were a huddle of broken, bleeding, and exhausted people. They were a mess of secrets and scars. But as the sun rose over the harbor, they were something else. They were a family. Dom looked up and saw Elena standing a few feet away, her eyes downcast, her hands trembling. She had saved the girl. She had chosen the child over the syndicate. Dom didn't say a word. He simply nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement. The war was over. Hans stood on the deck of the cutter watching them. He didn't come down. He knew his journey back to that circle would take years. But as Dom looked at him, he didn't see the traitor. He saw the man who had thrown the detonator away. "Let's go home," Letty whispered into Dom's ear. "Home is gone, Letty," Dom said, looking at his daughter's messy hair and the way she was gripping his thumb. "We're going to find somewhere new. Somewhere without an office. Somewhere without a safe. Somewhere with cookies?" Clarice asked, looking up with a tear-streaked smile. Dom laughed, a sound that felt like it was healing the cracks in his lungs. "Yeah, little bird. Somewhere with all the cookies in the world." As they walked toward the SUV, leaving the wreckage of the Mafia boss's life behind them, Dom realized that the ruin the Maid had warned him about hadn't been the destruction of his empire. It had been the destruction of his illusions. And in the ruins of the boss, he had finally found the man. The dust of the Mojave didn't settle, it danced. It swirled in the golden shafts of the late afternoon sun, coating the hood of the old primer gray Charger that sat outside a small nameless ranch house on the edge of the Arizona border. There were no cypress trees here. There were no biometric locks or mahogany-paneled offices. There was only the vast, indifferent beauty of the high desert and the sound of a wrench clinking against a radiator. Dom Toretto slid out from under the car, his face smeared with grease and sweat. The burns on his arms had healed into jagged silver maps of the night the stark Indomitable went down, but the fire in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked toward the porch. Letty sat in a rocking chair, a book in her lap and a glass of iced tea sweating on the table beside her. She looked different in the daylight, softer, her short hair beginning to grow out, the tactical gear replaced by a simple denim shirt. She caught his eye and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, the kind of smile that didn't have to hide a secret or a lie. "You're obsessing over that timing belt again, Dom," she called out, her voice melodic and free of the rasp of smoke and salt. "It's not obsessing if it needs to be perfect, Letty," he replied, leaning against the fender. "A machine only gives back what you put into it. It's the one thing in this world that doesn't have a hidden motive. I think the machine is fine. I think the driver just likes the noise," she teased. Dom chuckled, the sound deep and resonant. It was a sound he made often these days. They had been in the desert for 6 months. 6 months of silence, 6 months of healing, and 6 months of being nobody. To the world, Dominic Toretto was dead, lost to the Atlantic along with his empire. To the world, Letty Ripley was a ghost who had finally found her grave. But here, under the endless sky, they were simply two people trying to remember how to live without a target on their backs. The screen door creaked open and Clarice ran out, her pigtails bouncing. She wasn't wearing the pink jacket from the pier. She was wearing a pair of miniature overalls, and her hands were just as greasy as her father's. Daddy. I fixed the toaster, she shouted, holding up a small appliance that looked like it had been through a war of its own. Dom took the toaster, examining it with the gravity of a master craftsman. Good tension on the spring, little bird. But did you check the heating element? I checked it twice. Just like you said. Dom picked her up, swinging her into the air. Her laughter was the only soundtrack he ever wanted to hear again. He looked at her and saw the future. A future where she wouldn't know the names of the syndicate, where she wouldn't know the weight of a gold key to a private office. She would know how to fix a car, how to tell the truth, and how it felt to be loved without conditions. Elena's coming over for dinner, Clarice said, leaning her head against his shoulder. She said she's bringing the good flour for the empanadas. Dom's expression flickered for a second, a shadow of the past crossing his face, but it passed as quickly as a desert cloud. Elena had stayed. She hadn't asked for forgiveness and Dom hadn't offered it in words, but she had become a fixture of their new life. She lived in the small town 5 miles down the road, working as a librarian. She was the bridge to their past that didn't lead back to the blood. She had saved Clarice, and in doing so she had earned a seat at the table, even if the table was made of reclaimed wood and sat in a kitchen with peeling wallpaper. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, a familiar black motorcycle pulled into the drive. The rider was lean, wearing a dark leather jacket, his movements fluid and cautious. Han Solo pulled off his helmet, his hair wind-blown, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had been traveling for a long time. He didn't get off the bike immediately. He sat there looking at the house, looking at the family on the porch. Dom walked toward him, his hands in his pockets. He didn't have a gun. He didn't have a grudge. The city? Dom asked. Quiet, Han replied, his voice low. The vacuum Vito left behind. It stayed empty for a while. People were scared. Then the feds moved in on the scraps. McLean is doing 20 to life. The collective shattered into a dozen smaller pieces that are too busy fighting each other to look for ghosts. And you? Han looked at his hands. I've been making things right. Putting money back where it was stolen from. Closing the accounts I opened with Vito's name. It's a long road, Dom. It's the only road worth driving, Dom said. He reached out and squeezed Han's shoulder. It was a firm, grounding touch. There's a plate for you. If you're staying. Han looked at the house, at Letty who was waving from the porch, and at Clarice who was trying to show the toaster to the motorcycle. A small, genuine smile broke across his face. I think I could stay for a night. Maybe 2. They walked back to the house together. The boss who walked away, the wife who returned from the dead, and the brother who found his way back. Inside, the house smelled of garlic, roasted peppers, and wood smoke. They sat around a table that wasn't big enough for the feast, but it didn't matter. They passed plates, they told stories that didn't involve bullets, and they laughed until their ribs ached. For the first time in his life, Dom Toretto wasn't looking over his shoulder. He wasn't calculating the next move or listening for the sound of a silent alarm. He looked at Letty, her hand resting on his under the table. He looked at Clarice, who was explaining the mechanics of a toaster to a fascinated Han. He realized that the ruin the maid had feared was actually a clearing. The old life had to be burned to the ground so that this simple, fragile, beautiful thing could grow in its place. The secrets were gone. The Mafia was a memory. The betrayal had been faced and defeated. As the stars began to poke through the velvet sky of the desert, Dom walked out onto the porch one last time. He looked out at the horizon, at the dark shapes of the mountains that stood like sentinels. He felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost heavy. What are you thinking about? Letty asked, sliding her arms around his waist from behind. I'm thinking about the envelope, Dom whispered. The one Clarice found? No, Dom said, turning in her arms to face her. The one I'm going to give her for her 18th birthday. It's not going to have ledgers or photos of dead men. It's going to have the deed to this land. And a map to everywhere she wants to go. Letty leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady, unbreakable rhythm of his heart. She's going to be okay, Dom. We're all going to be okay. Yeah, Dom said, kissing the top of her head. We are. The camera pans back, leaving the small house behind, moving up toward the vast, glittering expanse of the Milky Way. The lights of the house are a tiny, defiant spark in the darkness. A beacon of a family that survived the storm and found the shore. The secrets are buried. The ghosts are at rest. And for the Torettos, the story doesn't end with a bang or a whisper. It ends with a new beginning. Thank you so much for watching. This has been an emotional ride, and I hope you enjoyed every twist, every turn, and every heart-stopping moment of Dom and Letty's journey. This story reminds us that no matter how deep the betrayal or how dark the night, family, the real kind, the kind you choose and fight for, is the only thing that truly lasts. If you love this story, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear a story about redemption today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next video. What was your favorite moment? Was it the reveal of the secret wife, or the final showdown on the sinking ship? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one.